Armour has always been used in warfare for as long as it has existed. From as far back as the Stone Age, where hardened pelts were used to protect the wearer, all the way up to the modern day, where bullet-resistant equipment is standard issue among soldiers. It's safe to say that armour has, and always will be, a core part of warfare. But how and why did armour evolve this way? And how did the image of a medieval knight become the face of armour? To find all that out, we have to go back to long before plate armour was even considered useful in war. At the turn of the 11th century, armour typically consisted of a hauberk, which is a shirt made from chainmail, and a conical or nasal helm, which gets the name from the nasal plate which extends from the middle of the helmet. One of the best examples of this we see in 1066, when William the Conqueror sailed across the English Channel to claim the throne of England in the Battle of Hastings. Hastings saw one of the largest and most impactful battles of the century, and mail was a core part of Norman success. William's armies were more than well equipped. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, 130 men or more were dressed in full-sleeve mail hauberks, which offered more than ample protection from most attacks which could be served by the enemy. The nasal helm also blocked many attacks to the face, but the face would quickly show to be the weakest point in a knight's armour. The 12th century was marked mainly by repairing the metaphorical cracks in the armour of a knight, and gave rise to the beginnings of, if not the most iconic piece of armour ever created, the Great Helm. But the 12th century also saw an extension of hauberks and the standardization of trousers, essentially chainmail trousers. The cause of these extensions is likely down to the fact that combat, especially in the Second and Third Crusades, was becoming more intense, with more combatants to fight. By the end of the 12th century, the nasal helm had all but reached the end of its relevance, morphing into an early form of the Great Helm, which would become in full swing, along with many other advancements, come the 13th century. The 13th century was the heyday of chainmail, with the beginning of plate's takeover through the creation of the coat of plates, a leather coat which was integrated with metal plates. These were highly effective. A German account from 1266 goes into how German plate armour, which was almost certainly a coat of plates, made them invulnerable to French attacks. The 13th century also saw the creation of plate armour for the hands and legs, which was likely developed earlier than other parts of the body due to how protective shields already were for those areas at the time. This century also saw the finalization of the Great Helm, which took a cylindrical form and covered the wearer's entire head, protecting from nearly every possible attack. However, defensive measures weren't the only piece of warfare being developed at this time, with the 13th century seeing the rise of one of the most integral pieces of machinery which drove the innovation of plate armour, the crossbow. The crossbow had been around for centuries at this time, being invented somewhere around the 7th to 5th century BC, but the 13th century had seen them go from a minor piece of machinery, barely being seen on the battlefield, to one of the most powerful and by far the most useful weapons in a kingdom's vast arsenals. The crossbow drove innovation in armour, which would come to great fruition come the 14th century. Finally, chainmail's time had come to an end as the pivotal piece of armour in the 14th century, as plate armour we now know today had come to fruition, with a knight's armour, at least on the surface, being completely covered in plate, although there were still some gaps for manoeuvrability, which is also a large concern for the fighters of the 1300s. This century also saw the creation of a highly influential helmet, the Houndskull bascinet, which would very quickly make the Great Helm completely obsolete. The bascinet offered very similar levels of protection, and even superior when it comes to the deflection of attacks. But the biggest part was how vastly maneuverable it was. Not only was it lighter and more sleek, but many, if not all of these helmets, were equipped with the clap visor, a liftable visor allowing for full visibility of a battlefield, while still keeping the protection aspect. The bascinet was also typically equipped with the chainmail aventail, which blocked and deflected any attack to the neck, or attempt to strike up the bottom of the helmet. Over the 14th century, armour would become more and more manoeuvrable as protection was already near perfect. This, however, would not be finished in the lifetimes of most 14th century knights, instead culminating in the 15th century. The 15th century was the peak of armour, at least in regards to plate and chainmail to fight in melee combat. Various battles across the century, such as the infamous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, showed the versatility of this armour. Despite that specific battle culminating in the outnumbered and out-armoured English knights of Henry V achieving a miraculous victory against the well-armoured French, thanks to use of powerful longbows and a brilliant strategy by the English king. Contrary to popular belief, the longbows were mostly unable to penetrate French armour, and instead French deaths primarily came from execution of French knights taken prisoner. The battle still showed how powerful and maneuverable the armour of the day was, with French armour able to resist most shots from longbows, which allowed knights to run, jump, mount horses, and wrestle without struggle. These armour suits were nothing short of medieval genius in their design. But unfortunately for the armoursmiths of the world, this magnificent age of armour was not to last. The first signs could be seen in the Siege of Constantinople, which brought cannons and gunpowder to the warfare scene in Europe. The lightly armoured Ottomans would defeat the much more heavily armoured, although fading, Byzantine Empire, which would also mark the end of the Roman Empire of old. By the 17th century, plate armour, as it was known, had become all but obsolete. This would of course come from the introduction of firearms, which could easily penetrate armour upon impact, which led to more of a focus on strategy and prevention of shots, rather than mitigating their effects. By World War I, the only piece of armour in use was the helmet, which had resurged around this time due to the brutal combat of trench warfare. Armour was pivotal throughout history and still remains important till this day, with advancements in bulletproof armour occurring as we speak, but the image of the medieval knight in shining armour shall always remain as the staple of armour as we know it. Thank you for watching.